So welcome everybody to our Stand for Israel meeting. Today's Tuesday, July 27, 2021. We're meeting again in Zoom. And today we're privileged to have JoAnn Magnuson giving us a review of history of anti-Semitism. We were supposed to do it last week, but then we ended up caught up with some last minute topics. So today she's going to start and have all the time that she needs. At first, I want to thank all our co-sponsoring organizations, like as you see on your screen. They're all wonderful organizations that in one way or another, I'm involved with them, and it's a privilege for us to have all of them co-sponsoring our Tuesday meetings. We did warn everybody that we're recording. So we told them if they don't want to be seen or heard, we told them what to do. And now first, I want to thank each and every one of you for taking out of your tonight, nice day in Minnesota, maybe a little bit too nice, but I'm very, very much thankful for you being here. And special thank you for Pastor Mac and Pastor Lynn Hammond. Typically, we will meet at their church at our regular place. And if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be able to get together and meet all of us. So special thank you. Dave and Nancy Smith are our regular volunteers. They actually can't be with us today. But typically when we meet in person, they're the first one there, always to help everyone and the last one to leave. And of course, for me as a Jewish Israeli man, it is always a privilege to have these two wonderful American Christian ladies, JoAnn and Deb, being my partners for these Tuesday meetings. It is always a privilege, and it's something that is very dear to my heart. Thank you so much. Today, JoAnn will do the review of history of anti-Semitism, and after that we will have a discussion and Q&A. The one thing that I want to say before I'm handing it to her is that if anyone don't know how to access our Zoom or to get information about our meeting, you can see the website on your screen right now. You can go to www.matmn.org/SFI. SFI is Stand for Israel, the acronym for Stand for Israel. And from time to time, when I have time, I'm actually adding our recordings there. Not all of them are there, but some of them are already there if you want to see previous sessions. And with no any further ado, I'm going to actually stop my presentation.
Okay, well, again, I want to apologize for my voice. As some of you know, I've been struggling with a cough and some kind of a crazy something or other, but I don't have COVID and I don't have pneumonia. I've been tested several times in the last few weeks. So anyway, it's and I know there's some activities at Living Word tonight, so I think we'll have a smaller group than usual. But and most of you who've been following our work for some years are aware that I've been teaching on the history of anti-Semitism for the last 40 years. I started out by having my photographer husband scan photographs, and we put them in the big slide tray, and I had to carry, all that equipment all over. And now, of course, we can do things on Zoom and on PowerPoint. So life has gotten easier, but I keep re-editing this particular PowerPoint, and some of it I know you're familiar with, but a couple of weeks ago, Ilan gave us a teaching on ways that anti-Semitism is reappearing in our time. And I think it's good for us to review how it started and why this is the longest hatred. And so anyway, I will see if I can get it up and working here, and then we'll go for it. Well, I've always enjoyed, in a crazy way, this poem that's credited to Ogden Nash, and several other people claim it too. But anyway, how odd of God to choose the Jews, but not so odd as those who choose the Jewish God yet hate the Jews. And I've always thought that was very strange. Many of you know my story about how my Scottish Presbyterian grandmother told me in December of 1941, when the World War was beginning, and the Japanese had just bombed Pearl Harbor, and Hitler declared war. And it was her birthday, her 76th birthday, and I was about 4.5 and had just started kindergarten. And she said to me, as I was helping her clean up the dishes, that this will be a terrible war, but Hitler will be defeated and the Jews will be back in their ancient land, and we must pray for that. Exactly how my Scottish Presbyterian grandmother decided that, but I assume she read it in the Bible. So it made a Bible reader and a friend of Israel out of me. So we want to remember as we're starting, and whatever your beliefs are about God and the Bible and all of that, you're welcome in our little study here. And according to the Bible, we want to remember that we are living on the far side of the angel with the flaming sword. So things are not perfect. On this side of the angel with the flaming sword, we are all something of a mixed bag. And some otherwise rather smart and good people have become enemies of the Jewish people, which always puzzled me. But anyway, we'll continue and see what's going on. Anti-Semitism down through the ages. This particular picture is one my daughter Jody took a few years back in 2006, when we were on one of our many trips to Poland and Ukraine. And in those days, we were still seeing anti-Semitic graffiti in Eastern Europe, even though there were many people there who really were friends of Israel and the Jewish people. There were still many who were living in the Nazi la-la land. And the term anti-Semitism is relatively new, even though the activity goes way back in history. And it is known as the longest hatred. But a kind of nutty guy named Wilhelm Marr, who was a German journalist, got the idea in 1879 that the German phrase for Jew hatred, Judenhass, was, kind of religiously oriented, and it would sound more scientific to have racial and not just religious prejudice. So he coined the phrase anti-Semitism. And there's been a debate about exactly how it should be spelled, whether it should be anti-Semitism with a hyphen or not. But many scholars advocate dropping the hyphen from the term anti-Semitism. And in most academic writing, this spelling has become the norm. The hyphen implies that there is such a thing as Semitism, which it is against, or that it is equally applied to all Semites, neither of which is the case. So anyway, I usually spell it without a hyphen, but whatever. Short history lesson. It all starts with Abraham, who was the Jewish patriarch. He began a journey from Ur of the Chaldees up to an area up in today's Syria, and then down to a little brief escape into Egypt, and then came back to the land of Israel and began a journey that still influences the ethics of Western civilization. Moses continued the travels. The Jews were in and out, but they managed to continue living in the land God said he was giving them. And Egypt and the Exodus and the wandering in the desert and back and forth and in and out, but they managed to keep going. The biblical texts of Leviticus and Deuteronomy still define much of the ethical basis of Western civilization. So what got everything started? Well, God made a private covenant with the Jewish people. It wasn't an easy challenge because he really wanted them to prepare to talk about him to the rest of the world. But he kind of protected them in those early years. So they lived in a fairly private society. And they were different from most of the other people roundabout, because they believed in one God, and Abraham and his family believed in one God, and he continued to tell his children and grandchildren the story. Now, when they, of course, were captured and taken into custody in Egypt, which lasted for about 400 years, the Egyptians were getting worried about the Israelites living among them. They thought they were getting too much power. That seems to happen often in history. The Jews were pretty good about teaching their kids how to read and write and do arithmetic, which is a very useful set of habits to have. And therefore, other people appreciated having them around until they learned to have a few local people read and write and do arithmetic. And then they were afraid the Jews might use their ability to take over. So then they began kicking them out or trying to imprison them where they were. So Moses led his people out of Egypt to the land of Israel. It took a fairly long hike, about 40 years. And they ran into a number of enemies along the way. Who were the enemies and why? Well, a couple of them, there's quite a few mentioned in the Bible, but some of the main ones back in the book of Numbers were Balaam the Midianite and his friends. He sort of realized that there was something special about the Jews. They were a people set apart, and they weren't seen as among the nations, and they seemed to have a special relationship with God. And so he was kind of trying to play both ends against the middle and was riding off on his donkey. And the donkey actually was a little smarter than he was and noticed the angel with the flaming sword standing along the road in front of them. So anyway, that's a cool story, and you can read it in Numbers 23, verse 9. So he was sort of trying to be an enemy and a friend, and a lot of people down through history have done that too. And then later on in the book of Esther, while the Jews are in another kind of captivity, Haman the Persian was against the Jews, and he had some influence on the king. And his complaint was their laws are different from those of other people, and they do not observe the king's laws. So it is not in the king's interest to let them remain. And if you've read the book of Esther, you know the story, and you might want to look it up again before Purim next year. But in this picture, we see Esther pointing out that he had tried to sell out her uncle, and all of a sudden the king decided he preferred his wife to good old Haman. So anyway, the Jews managed to survive that one. Lots of stories like that continue. And historically, Jewish monotheism opposed Greek and Roman paganism, and most everybody was pagan and worshiped the god of the sun and the moon and the stars and the ocean and all of that good stuff. And the Jews said, nope, there's just one God. He made this other stuff. He isn't one of many gods. So Western civilization, as we know it today, is based on both Judeo-Christian ethics and Greco-Roman political systems, all of which work differently at different times and sometimes work better than others. And then we have Roman rule in Israel. So the Jews were still living there, but they were under the rule of the Romans. Later, of course, the Romans pretty much kicked all the Jews out and took the menorah with them, and that is pictured on the Arch of Titus in Rome to this very day. And here we see a map of the Roman Empire up until the year 117. They originally had the kind of pale ivory territories, and then from AD 14 to 117, they took over these other places. As we learned a few weeks ago when we were talking about St. Augustine, that this North African country was involved at that time with many different tribes of people, many of whom were quite scholarly by this point in history. And there was a lot of back and forth and who was in charge where. And then, of course, they winding up in England, even the Romans were at that time. So anyway, but you can see the Nolan civilization at that time was pretty much centered around the Mediterranean Sea. One of the big questions that Christians need to be very clear on: did the Jews kill Jesus? And certainly Jewish leaders were participating in that, although many Jewish people were followers of Jesus and many people had never heard of him. But John, who writes the fourth gospel in the New Testament, tells the story of how he recognized Jesus as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And Jesus himself says later in his life, "No one takes my life from me. I lay it down of myself." Now, whatever you think of Jesus and whatever your background and religious views are, the point that everybody should remember is that whoever you think Jesus is, he said that he didn't come to just take over, that he knew he was supposed to lay down his life as a payment for the sins of people. And however your theology writes that, it's important to remember that he said that no one takes his life from him. So other monotheistic religions followed Judaism. And a few points to remember. Here we see the model of the second temple that was there at the time of Jesus in the New Testament. And everyone we meet in the New Testament, practically everyone, is Jewish, except for a few Romans. So the early church was Jewish. And as the church moved into the larger world, St. Paul, in his writings, told Christians not to be arrogant toward the Jews. If you have read Romans 11 recently, it might be good to review it. But unfortunately, this advice was generally ignored. And by the 2nd century, some Christians were accusing the Jews of deicide, of the deliberate killing of God, which is not what the story was about. And by the 4th century, we've got the Roman Empire is kind of fading, and Constantine took over. And there's a lot of story that I do in more detail on other slide presentations for people who want to learn all of that. But basically, by the time we get to the 300s, after the time of Christ, we have the conversion of Constantine. Whether he thought it was good for politics or whether he was seriously committed to the God of the Bible, we won't find out until we get there and see whose name tags are on the table. But in 313, the Edict of Milan, which he engineered, permitted religious toleration for Christians. Up until that time, both Christians and Jews were being persecuted by the Romans. But once the Christians were free to practice their religion, some bad ideas crept into the Christian teachings. And we see the rise of what is called supersessionism, which says that God is finished with the Jews. He gave them his land and the story of the Old Testament, but many people began to believe that since the Jews didn't accept Jesus, God was finished with them. And the other claim is that the church is now the new Israel and supersedes the Jews. And that's been pretty much the view in many Christian communities down through the years, until really after World War II and the Holocaust. Then both the Catholic Church and some of the Protestants began to take a good look at the scriptures and think, oh my goodness, things have gone really awry. But as we pointed out, all of the early Christians were Jewish or were influenced by Jewish beliefs and lived in that part of the world. And after the Romans kicked all the Jews out, and the Christians too, many of the Christians wandered up into Asia Minor and then over into areas around Greece and Rome on the northern side of the Mediterranean Sea. And by the year 100, various people who had never really known too much about Judaism began to become Christians. And we see people like Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, Origen of Alexandria, and later Eusebius, who were early church fathers. And many otherwise strong Christian teachers began to believe that God was finished with the Jews. And again, I have no way to explain how God decides to intervene in human history and how much he allows free will to take its course. Anyway, this is starting a very, very bad time of Christianity. Irenaeus, who was one of the early church fathers too, was born in 130 and died in 202, and lived in what is today modern day, well, first Turkey and then in France, Gaul in those days. And he explained Jewish law, which he didn't really know very many Jews, but he had seen what the Jewish Testament in the Bible said. And he explained that Jewish law was necessary for a time because of human sinfulness. But with the coming of Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem, that signaled that the time of the Jews and their law was over. According to Irenaeus, Jesus was attacking the Jewish claim to be able to know the Father without accepting the Son. He relied on the parables of the wicked tenants and the wedding feast and some of the other writings in the New Testament to prove that God had destined the Gentiles to replace the unresponsive Jews. And then we get some later church fathers, St. Jerome, Gregory of Nyssa, St. John Chrysostom, and comments like these were left in print. The Jews are serpents, the image of Judas, their psalms and prayers are the braying of donkeys. The brood of vipers, haters of goodness. Jews are inveterate murderers, possessed by the devil. Jews are abandoned by God. God has always hated the Jews. Now, anyone who read the whole Bible, including the New Testament, should not have come to those conclusions, alas. There's a few bright spots along the way. A couple of weeks ago, I was giving you a little history of St. Augustine, and a woman named Paula Fredrickson, who's a Catholic scholar, had investigated his writings very closely. But in the 2nd century, theologians and church fathers became more concerned with making the break with anything Jewish and beginning to take a very uncompromising posture of theological and political opposition. Blanket policies condemning the Jews were becoming common. However, down through history, every so often a Bible scholar who read the text more carefully stood up and said, God was not finished with his Jewish people. And Augustine was one of those people, and some of his lesser known writings make that quite clear. I was really interested to discover that because I've been always looking for things like that in Christian history. But we come to the Council of Nicaea, and as Christians, we're glad that the story was continuing, but we're concerned that it was losing its Jewish roots. And the Christian church becomes more or less a replacement for the Roman Empire. The Romans were kind of getting disorganized and losing their control of all of these various places they had taken over, particularly in the western part of Europe and up into England. There's another Christian group in the Eastern, what's today known as the Eastern Orthodox churches. And while they became anti-Semitic too, but they take a somewhat different tack on things. Anyway, Emperor Justinian was one of the famous ones who got things organized in the western part of the Christian community. He also put together the Corpus Juris Civilis, which is a list of rules and regulations for Christian societies. And that prohibited the Jews from building synagogues, from reading the Bible in Hebrew, from assembling in public, celebrating Passover before Easter, and testifying against Christians in court. So that was definitely rules that favored Christians who had recently become free of the rule of the Romans. But remember our mixed bag. That's one of my themes of what we need to see in the history of the world and how we have seen our Jewish forebears. And our little cartoon of the confused looking guy with the mixed bag kind of indicates what many scholars and much of the Christian church was thinking in those days. The attacks on Jews continue. In 415 of the Christian or Common Era, Cyril, the Bishop of Alexandria, expelled the Jews and gave their property to a Christian mob. In 632, we have the beginning of forced baptism. So in many places, Jewish communities were forced to march through a river and be baptized, which they were not accepting in their heads and hearts, but were forced to in order to stay alive in the area. In 871, Jews were stripped of property rights, and that has long-term effects because eventually, if you're not allowed to own property and you're not allowed to farm and settle down and things like that, you have to be prepared to move on a moment's notice. And therefore, items that you want to be involved with need to fit into your suitcase if you have to leave town. So things like small coins and cash and jewelry became mainly the industries that the Jews participated in. And by the 10th century, 900s, custom of hitting a Jew on the face on Good Friday and stoning Jewish homes on Palm Sunday. As I've read about some of this, I remember one of our Israeli guides from years ago. He was an older guy who'd been born in the land of Israel, and his grandfather had taken them from somewhere in the Russian area and settled them in Israel long before the state. But he used to tell us about when his grandfather would put up kind of the tent where they would celebrate Sukkot. He always made sure that none of the boards holding the things holding the tent up made a cross. And his grandson asked him, well, the tent isn't as strong as it could be if those were crossbars. He said, Jews don't want to be reminded of the cross. And I thought that was an important thing for we modern Christians to be aware of, that the cross that many of us feel warm and treasure is really bad news for our dear Jewish friends and brothers. But the idea of Jews being seen as selfish money lenders begins to grow. And we have all these paintings of Jews with bags of money and counting out coins. Other monotheistic religions followed Judaism. Christianity added to the Jewish text, but we didn't change the original text. We added the New Testament, which also was written at a time when most of the Christians were Jews. Islam came later in the 500s and into the 600s, and they revised the Jewish narrative and really changed the story to great extent. So here we have Muhammad, who lived from 570 to 632. And the Muslim teaching, although I'm not saying that all Muslims believe this, but in the Quran, the indication is that the Muslims believe that that their founder, Muhammad, was the restorer of an original, uncorrupted, monotheistic faith that really was the faith of Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and the other prophets. So they felt that the Christians and the Jews had changed the whole story. And of course, they changed it to suit their particular view of history. And then, of course, the Muslims become pretty much in charge. As we see on this map, the green area is controlled by countries ruled by Islam. And the Christian lands were up here in this area. And then one of the popes had challenged Christian warriors to take back Jerusalem from from assuming that it was the Muslims, but actually the people were so confused that they killed off many Jews in communities along the way. And there were 8 crusades. And we could do a whole series on the Crusades sometime, but basically there were 8 crusades. We have the First Crusade, the Second Crusade, the Third Crusade, the Fourth Crusade. Then in between, a nutty group of people gathered a whole bunch of children and had them march down to Jerusalem. And then the 5th, 6th, and 7th Crusades are in the 1200s and early 13. Well, and by the late 1300s, we've got the last crusade. So anyway, the Crusades left Christians with a pretty bad reputation as being trying to impose their faith with the sword. And European Christians were challenged to retake Jerusalem from the Seljuk Turks, but debts owed to Jews were canceled for the Crusaders. So if you owed money to a Jew that you'd borrowed money from, you didn't have to pay him back, and you could gather up your stuff and go off on crusade. In 1215, the Jews in many areas were forced to wear distinctive dress and live in restricted areas. And the Star of David is a badge of shame, and the pointed hat were required in many areas. And you see that repeated when we get to the Nazi era. In 1242, burnings of the Talmud and other Jewish writings were taking place. So things like host desecration. Christians believed the strangest things. The Jews basically wanted to live in their own quiet little areas, keep Shabbat, eat kosher, and not rock the boat. But the Christians were, building up all these ideas of what the Jews were doing, and they believed. Now, remember, in those days, the Catholics were in charge, and I'm not anti-Catholic. There's a lot of good Catholics around, but some of the strange things that went on in the Middle Ages are not defensible. But anyway, they believed that the communion wafer had actually turned into the body of Jesus as it was sitting on the altar. And so they thought, well, the Jews, of course, hate Jesus, so they must be sneaking into our churches and stabbing the communion wafer. Now, that would be laughable if it wasn't involved in so much tragedy. But here we see some of these paintings that were hanging in medieval churches showing the Jews torturing the communion wafer. And they also believed that the Jews kidnapped Christian children. Whenever there was a child who got lost or missing, they were just sure that the local Jews had captured that child and murdered it to make Passover matzah. Now, we all know matzah is made of flour and water, but alas, they thought it was the blood of Christian children. And then, of course, by the 14th century, we've got the beginning of the bubonic plague. I think we could all appreciate plagues a little more after the last year and a half, but that, of course, was blamed on the Jews. Not that the Jews didn't get sick, but the Jews had some strange habits that had been recommended by Moses, that, washing your hands before you eat and little strange things like that, which weren't practiced during much of the Christian Middle Ages. So therefore, they thought that the Jews were either poisoning their wells or somehow poisoning their food. So the bubonic plague, and we can appreciate that now. They didn't know, well, they knew a lot less than we know, but we still don't exactly know what's causing the stuff that's been spreading around here the last year and a half. But you see continuing examples of ignorance leading to anti-Semitic accusations. Throughout Europe, people were dying in huge numbers from a pandemic that they called the Black Death. And the bubonic plague, it was called bubonic because of the little bubbles that were, welts that were growing all over people's skin was part of the disease. But people died in thousands, actually. The whole population of Europe was significantly minimized during that period. And this was also a time when international shipping was becoming more common. And that, of course, got motivated by the Crusades too. And he wanted to sail to get more people over to conduct a crusade. And as international shipping became more common, rats often traveled in the new areas on ships. I mean, to this very day, keeping the rats off of ships that have food stuffs stored on them is a problem. And this disease was most likely spread by fleas on the rats, but people weren't figuring that out, and they again blamed it on the Jews. So here we have burning of the Talmud and Jewish prayer books, and Jews were forced to watch and then were tortured and killed. And then the Inquisition gets started in the 12th century and continues up until the 18th century. And this was not originally aimed at the Jews, but at all heretics, anybody who taught something about the Bible that wasn't accepted by the Catholic Church. However, as Jews in many countries were being forced to convert, then the Inquisition, especially in Spain, that was a big deal there, the Inquisition began to target the so-called conversos, people who had been forced to convert, to see, they'd peek in their windows and see if they were celebrating Shabbat on Friday and Saturday instead of on Sunday. And then people were tortured to confess to things they hadn't done. During this 200-year period, Jews were expelled from most of Western Europe, England in 1290 by Edward I. And interestingly, even by the time of Shakespeare, the Jews had not been invited back to live in England. So all of the stories that Shakespeare writes about things involving Jews were written about people they'd never met. In France in 1306, and then again about 100 years, or about 90 years later, Jews were expelled from France. Hungary in 1349 and 1360, the German states. Remember, Germany wasn't really organized until much later in history, but the various German states were forced out all their Jews in 1348 and again in 1498. Austria in 1421, Lithuania, we're getting up there on the edge of Russia, in 1445 and 1495, Spain in 1492, we all know that. Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but it wasn't the only thing that happened that year. The Jews were kicked out. And then many went to Portugal, which was right next door. And a few years later, they were kicked out of Portugal. In most countries, the Jews were first welcomed. Remember, Jews always taught their kids to read and write and do arithmetic, and most of the crowned heads of Europe were not particularly good at those functions, so Jews were welcome. They could keep records. But then when anybody who keeps the records, of course, has some influence. And then the Jews became suspect and later were expelled. And many of them moved, where could you go? I mean, they didn't have ships to sail to America, and it hadn't really been discovered yet, or was just about to be. So they moved east, and that's why we have so many Jews settled in Poland by the time of World War II. And I know some of you have been to Poland with us. I've been leading trips to Poland. I guess we've done 15 of them now since about 1993. And we were fortunate to meet some Christians in Poland who had been part of the underground and were supportive of Israel and the Jewish people. And so we've been working with them and attending some of their summer conferences. And if you haven't been to Poland with us, we hope once air travel gets easier, we can go again. I'm hoping I can do one more trip to Israel. I've done 69, so I'd like to do 70, but at age 84, I'm not sure if I'll be able to do that. Anyway, but the Jews were expelled and most of them moved towards Eastern Europe and then also North Africa. And then during that period of time, in the years leading up to the Reformation, most of the, as I've said, most of the Christians in Europe were not educated. And so people didn't really read the Bible for themselves. It wasn't so much that they were forbidden to, it was they weren't able to. And therefore they began doing dramas and photographs. They didn't have movies either, but they drew pictures. And many of the pictures drawn in that time displayed Jesus and most of the disciples looking pretty much like Swedes and Norwegians with blue eyes and blonde hair. And the only Jewish looking one among the disciples is the role of Judas, who was actually thought to be the only Jew. They forgot, of course, reading the Christmas story and discovering that Jesus was Jewish, but never mind, prejudice doesn't respond well to facts. And then, of course, we have the two figures of synagoga and ecclesia, the synagogue representing the Jews with the broken staff, blinded eyes, carrying a torn prayer book, and then the picture of ecclesia, which is the word for the church, with a crown on her head, raising a cross, carrying communion ware. Anyway, this was the kind of thing that young people who didn't read and write were being shown in their churches. And they were learning about God and prayer and lots of good things, but this came along with the story. Then we come to the Reformation, and those of us who are Protestants would like to think, oh goody, things are going to get better, but they didn't get better in a hurry. And Martin Luther was actually a raging anti-Semite. I was a Lutheran for many years, and there's a lot of things I liked about the Lutheran Church, but Luther and his later ideas, of course, he was not too well in his later years, and he was kind of a hothead from the beginning. And therefore, before he died in 1543, he was quite ill, but he managed to drag himself out of bed and write a terrible little book called something about the failings of the Jews. And it lists all kinds of untrue stories about how the Jews were persecuting people. And even Calvin, who was much less angry, still held most of the Jews in contempt. In Germany, there's a church in Wittenberg today that still has these symbols available. Now, in recent years, there's been some law court proceedings about this, and many people were trying to insist that these things should be taken down. What they decided to do, I think, was probably a good idea. They published and mounted explanations about how terrible this was and how this was part of the anti-Semitic craziness that was going on, believing that the Jews suckled pigs. You know, of course, the whole thing is pigs are unclean animals and Jews avoided them like the plague. But the Lutherans got the idea that the Jews were eating food and sucking milk from pigs. I mean, the nonsense of that is just unbelievable. But the Wittenberg church is where Luther preached, and he was in favor of this sort of thing. The sculpture at the heart of this dispute, and there's been a recent court case about this where several people had sued to have these things removed. But I think even with some of the stuff we're doing in the States with Southern honoring of Southern generals and stuff, it's better maybe to leave the statues and the bad stuff in place and then make it very clear what was wrong with it and why this should not be honored, but should be known. I think we don't do ourselves any favor when we eliminate the bad sides of history. But anyway, this is one of Germany's last remaining examples of the vulgar anti-Semitic folk art that was common during this era. And the stone image here shows Jews suckling the teats of a sow as a rabbi looks intently under its leg and tail. This hateful symbolism is that the Jews obtain their sustenance and their scriptures from demonic forces such as unclean animals. I mean, craziness. But when I was in Germany, we visited Luther's church, and this is the entry to the Stadtkirche, the town church in eastern German town of Wittenberg, Luther's home church. And of course, in Spain, we had in 1469 the marriage of the royal cousins, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, and they were part of the Spanish Inquisition, and then 1492 kicked all the Jews out of Spain. And all of this bad history isn't true Christianity. And I'm a Christian. I believe in the Christian message, but I fully understand why non-Christians worry about this kind of a history and have a good reason to reject anything good about Jesus. There were a few other bright spots. Frederick the Great was the king of Prussia in the 1700s. And during that time, he had a Christian chaplain. Now, Frederick himself was not particularly a Bible reader, but he and his chaplain were discussing the Bible, whether or not it was true. And Frederick kind of issued a challenge to his chaplain and said, "Can you prove to me in one sentence that the Bible is true?" After thinking about it for a while, the chaplain von Zeiten said, "I don't need an entire sentence. All I need is 2 words to prove that the Bible is true and that God doesn't lie. Those 2 words are the Jews." Now, this story is told by a number of famous people, but anyway, there were people who recognized in the scriptures that God has a permanent covenant with the Jews. So we come up to pre-World War I, and at this time, in the late 1700s, Catherine the Great, the Queen of Russia at that time, the Empress, decided that they should have this special area that was kind of fenced off, and it was called the Pale of Settlement. And Jews were confined to live in that part of the country. It's between Austria, Hungary, Germany, Romania, and over here in Russia. And it's a big part of Poland. Poland ceased to be a nation recognized on the map from 1771 to the end of World War I. So during that period of time, the Jews were forced to move into this area. Now, some Jews who were effective business people and had relations with Christians in business were allowed to move out. But for the most part, most of the Jews and the largest Jewish population in the world lived in what had been the Pale of Settlement as sitting ducks when World War II began. And you remember the stories of Fiddler on the Roof and the shtetls and the pogroms and all of that. That pretty much takes place during this time of history, during this area. But this is much of modern Poland. And then we come to the Enlightenment. And it was probably welcomed and needed, but that kind of moved away from religion generally, both Judaism, Christianity, and anything else. And the Enlightenment ushered in the age of reason. But we would hope then that people would get away from the idea of hating the Jews if their religion was the problem. But by this time, things like eugenics were beginning to be studied more and more as we get into the 20th century. And while secularism was emphasized over religion, but hatred of the Jews remained. I remember our friend that we met in the early slides about the guy who said that anti-Semitism, was a nicer description rather than Jew hatred. So they changed what they called it, but they still believed it. Many Eastern European Jews became assimilated. The myth of racial superiority of the Aryan race, which of course Hitler discovered and was all excited about, which is a bunch of nonsense. Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion was the book that was written at that time in the early 1900s, possibly the late 18, but anyway, the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion was published all over the world. And of course, at this time, we're beginning to get the printing press, and we're getting to see literature flooding the world, and more people learning to read, which is good at some levels and not so good when they're reading propaganda. And during this period in France, of course, we had the French uprising, and shortly after the American Revolution. And things were not very good for the Jews in France. But at this time, there was a French army captain named Alfred Dreyfus, and he was one of the officers in this particular unit. But someone in that unit had been accused of passing secrets to the Germans, who were at that moment in history enemies. The French and the Germans took turns affiliating and fighting each other. But anyway, at that time, Theodor Herzl, who had been born and raised in Hungary, was a rather secular Jewish person. He was a journalist who was sent to Paris to cover the trial of Dreyfus. And as he sat there taking notes and watched when the whole audience stood up when Dreyfus was convicted falsely of treason, the only reason he was picked was because his name Dreyfus was known to be a Jewish family name, and that was the only Jewish family name they could identify on this list of people in that particular unit. So anyway, as he saw all of these people rising to condemn this poor guy, and he was stripped of his honors and all of that, he was sent out to one of the islands and was imprisoned for a while. But anyway, that convinced Herzl, who had said previously that we Jews should just, give up religion, blend in with the Christian culture. The Christians are giving up Christianity. Religion's going to be gone, both Jewish and Christianity. Let's just play the game and get along. And he realized that that wasn't going to work, that the hatred of Jewish people was still so intense that they'd be remembered even if the religions went away. And to prove that, Dreyfus's granddaughter, Madeleine Levy, died at Auschwitz in 1943. But Herzl then began a big campaign to get the Jews all over Europe, many of whom were being kicked out in Russia, to come to resettle the land of Israel. And propaganda prepares the way for the Holocaust. And we're seeing this growing in Germany and throughout Europe in that period of time. The Jews were pictured as vultures trying to control the world, or as snakes trying to eat up everybody else's property. And propaganda was very effective. So what factors played into the rise of Nazism? Well, we have totalitarianism, and while Stalin and Hitler were not friends, they both operated with this particular form of government, state control of all aspects of life by a faction or an individual with no limits to the authority. And fascism, which is a form of socialism with a capitalist veneer. The word derives from fasces, which is the Roman symbol of collectivism and power. It's a bundle of rods tied together with a protruding axe. And that was the theme of the Nazis and also the Italians. And what factors played into the Nazi ideology? Well, the Germans liked Norse Aryan mythology and Wagnerian music. Richard Wagner was a real popular musician in that time. His music is beautiful, but his ideas were awful. And here was a painting that a US Army group found in an office when they liberated the Nazi camps. Hitler is displayed here as Lohengrin, one of the Wagnerian characters. And the idea of Blut and Boden, blood and soil, ethnicity based on descent and homeland, high value on rural life, even though most of the leaders like to live in big cities where they had power. But anyway, they were really promoting this ethnic version, which was big in America. I know a while back I did my presentation on the history of eugenics, and that was very big in America. And Hitler sent some of his people, when he came to power in 1933, he sent some of his doctors and scholars to study with people in America who were studying the eugenics movement. And they really believed that different races had different mental capacities, that Blacks and Jews were not intended to have leadership positions and were less intelligent than the white, blonde, and blue-eyed people. I haven't noticed that myself, but. And then I think we learned in that lesson about Sir Francis Galton, who lived from 1822 to 1911. And he was one of the founders of the the Nazi eugenics movement. He coined the phrases nature versus nurture, whether people were born to be in certain ways or whether the way they were raised made a difference. And he was really big on eugenics. Later in his life, he wrote a novel about a utopian society which developed ways to breed smarter and healthier human beings. And that was really big at the University of Minnesota. There was a guy, Professor Dite at the university, who in the 20s and 30s was really big on eugenics. And I remember my own mother, who after she graduated from high school and was a super duper typist, was hired by a professor at the university. And she absorbed a lot of the thinking of that eugenics movement. I remember as a kid listening to some of the things she was saying and thinking, I don't know about that. But I'm an only child and I lived with 4 adults, so I didn't have too much time to read children's stories, and I heard a lot of adult conversation, which meant I really didn't become a child until I was probably 35. And then there was Charles Davenport. He was another one of the eugenics. He was the director of the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory out in New York State in 1910. And that's where all of this eugenics research was headquartered. And they kept the eugenics record office. And that's where the Nazis came to study about how to recognize eugenic preferences. And Kaiser Wilhelm Society had this center in Austria in 1911. And all of this predates the Nazis, but the Nazis were paying attention to this kind of research. Many serious scientists have been involved with this center, but in the pre-Nazi years, it promoted research that led to the horrors of the Holocaust. Both the US and German scientists were interested in breeding healthier and stronger populations. What to do with the weak and where race fits into this study raised moral issues that no one was paying attention to. So we see the T4 project, which is early in the Nazi era, the law for the prevention of hereditary diseased offspring. Many, many small children who were regarded as damaged in some way were euthanized. And that happened in America too during the 1930s. Once we began to see what the Nazis were doing with this information, eugenics became less popular in the States, but it really had a big heyday here in the early 30 years in America. And this castle in Austria, in Linz, was the euthanasia center, and at least 50,000 people, mainly children who had some kind of birth defects, were gassed and killed by lethal injection during the early Nazi years, even before the war got started. And the Nazis really lost the war because they were more interested in shipping the Jews to the death camps than they were in feeding their troops at the front. And here's Nazism was an applied biology, said Rudolf Hess, who was the head of the camp at Auschwitz. Here, a gypsy woman is being measured to see what her racial hygiene would mean for her. And the Nazi eugenist guy named von Verschower was examining twins. His assistant, Joseph Mengele, continued these experiments at Auschwitz. And we have the Nazi doctors, again, they had a big thing going there at Auschwitz and deciding on life and death among the patients in the medical blocks. And Mengele was very friendly with these little children, particularly the twins, and they would operate on one twin and not on the other, and then see what kind of differences it made. And years ago, I heard a woman speak at the university who was the surviving member of a set of twins who had been operated on by Mengele. And propaganda prepares the way for the Holocaust. Here we see the Jew as the poison mushroom, and we see German school books with a Jew luring children to follow him and be sold into slavery. And here, a little boy in a German school had to draw a picture of what a Jewish nose looked like. Propaganda played a big role. But it wasn't limited just to Germany. In America too, nice guys like Henry Ford He published the Ford International Weekly, the Dearborn Independent. He had his own newspaper, and he forced all of his Ford dealers to sell this newspaper and distributed it all over. And he wrote continually all this stuff from the propaganda that was traveling around about the Jews. The protocols of the learned elders of Zion was repeated in the Dearborn newspapers. So America was seeing nice guys like Henry Ford. He was, doing so much for the economy, but bad ideas. And the Holocaust from 1933 to 1945, Hitler became chancellor in 1933. Immediately, the Nuremberg laws were developed, and which identified and isolated the Jewish population. Kristallnacht in 1938, the night of broken glass, where the Nazi army attacked Jewish businesses and synagogues, burned down synagogues. The Anschluss, which was the German march into Austria, and the invasion of Poland in September of 1939. And remember, we saw on that map how the Jews had been forced to live in what Poland was not recognized as a separate country until 1919 at the end of World War I. And so by World War II, they'd only been in business as a nation state, for about 20 years. And then all of a sudden the Nazis move in there and take over. And then a lot has already gone on by January of 1942, when the Wannsee Conference, which is a town on a lake that's just north of Berlin. I've been there several times. It always reminds me of Lake Minnetonka. It's kind of a big lake like that where people have built really nice cabins, not really cabins, often really lovely homes on the shores of that lake. And that's where people like to go to relax from the busy days in Berlin. But there's a number of films about the Wannsee Conference. If you're interested, we might show one of those sometime. I mean, I'm not trying to take us back into history and make us live there, but I think we want to be really careful as we see anti-Semitism restoring itself in America and all over the Western world, that we don't forget what happened in 1933 to 1945. And the building of the death camps was planned and organized at that meeting of the Wannsee Conference. And by 1945, at least 6 million Jews had been murdered, and many more people, others who were not favoring the Nazis also, something like 15 million people, innocents, not soldiers, had been killed in World War II. And it's a note to remember, Nazism as a philosophy is not Christian. It's basically very pagan. And they believed in, modern versions of Roman and Greek gods and all of that sort of stuff. But most Nazis were members in good standing in Christian churches, and many of them remained in good standing. It took a lot to get the Germans to deal with what had happened. The Nazi policy was threefold: identify, isolate, and exterminate. And you saw all of their passports, their government IDs were marked with a large red J, which indicated Jew. So it was pretty hard to hide the fact that you were Jewish. Jews, like all other German citizens, were required to carry identity cards, but their cards were stamped with a large red J, and this allowed the police to easily identify them. And the Nuremberg laws, of course, were passed, and everybody's excited. Well, things had gone badly for the Germans after World War I. They were defeated. They were not used to being defeated. And the country was somewhat divided. And then the whole financial breakdown all over the world was going on, but it hit particularly hard in Germany. And there are photographs of people going to the store to buy bread with wheelbarrows filled with German paper marks. People just could hardly afford to live. So they were looking for a new form of government, and they found it. a willing volunteer in Adolf Hitler. The meetings of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, huge crowds, martial music, mass psychology. They loved these big meetings where people in uniform are marching in and waving the flag. Hitler's goals were made very clear with the book he wrote while he was in prison. He was in prison, but he was pretty well cared for while he was in prison, and he had time and ability to write his book, Mein Kampf, which means my struggle. And here we see some of the cartoons that the Nazis published. Here we see this guy who obviously is a Jew looking through the flags of Britain, America, and Russia. The Nazis had first made a treaty with Stalin, and then he didn't keep that, so the Russians partnered with the US, which kind of led to problems of unraveling that relationship after World War II, if you're old enough to remember. And again, the propaganda becomes much more sophisticated. We've got Leni Riefenstahl, who was Hitler's favorite movie producer, and she produced this film, The Triumph of the Will, which really celebrates the whole Nazi idea. It's interesting. I've watched the film with American English subtitles on occasions. I think I have a copy of it here somewhere. And of course, we see Goebbels. And I watched a film the other night while I've been stuck in my house. I've been looking through some of my old Holocaust films. And some of those are worth watching. It is important to remember what happened. But my son has been rereading this summer War and Peace, the Russian novel. And I remember reading it when he was in college and was studying it, and that's a long time ago. But he said just rereading it reminds him, and he said the character studies in that book are so accurate to things that keep continuing to happen. And people who want power know how to get it. And Goebbels certainly was one of those. At the end, he and his wife, I think they had 6 children, beautiful little kids. They murdered their children and then took their own lives as Hitler was committing suicide. But anyway, these films, the Eternal Jew, this stuff was all popular, and movies, in America were becoming popular. Even movies in color and sound in the 30s, where this was a big time with the movies, and they were big in Germany like they were in America. And all of this Nazi propaganda was being absorbed by innocent people going to movies. So the Nazis marched on Poland in September of 1939. And of course, the 3.5 million Jews were trapped in that time. Hitler watches with pleasure as his troops march into Poland. And while we see these troops with horses and buggies, that was mainly what the Poles had to deal with. They didn't have much modern military equipment, which Hitler had been building up, and the air battles that had just started in World War I really came into full flower in World War II. And in Ukraine and Belarus, the places east of Poland, that's where they started what's known as the Holocaust by bullets. And even before the official war started, they were already rounding up Jews in these little towns in southern Russia and Belarus in the eastern part of Poland. And the Einsatzgruppen would gather all the Jews from the town and take them out in the field and shoot them. And then the other Jews were having to dig the mass graves while they watched their families being murdered. And here we see the lovely building on the shores of the lake where the Wannsee Conference was held. A number of Nazi leaders were invited with an invitation that read, "You are invited to a discussion about the final solution to the Jewish problem. Breakfast will be served." The Jews were first identified, then isolated, and finally exterminated. They were forced to wear the yellow star, which was the ancient Jewish King David symbol. And first we have the ghettos, and the Jews were rounded up from the main cities and moved to ghettos that were built kind of as a suburb to these large German cities, and Polish, mainly in Poland, actually. Major ghettos were found in Krakow, Warsaw, Vilna, Łódź, Lublin, Theresienstadt. Those were the better known ones. But there were, in recent years, they've actually discovered sites of 40,000 ghettos and small camps that weren't previously recognized. And these were operated by the Nazis between 1933 and 45. So again, you can see how much of the German money, which was being produced by, building military equipment, and they were just pouring all that money into places to kill the Jews. Then we come to the death camps. I've been to Auschwitz a number of times. It's a painful place to see, but it's important. When we go to Poland, we usually visit at least 4 of the 6 death factories, which are Auschwitz, Birkenau, Belzec, Chełmno, Majdanek, Sobibor, and Treblinka. And those 4 or those 6 big camps are located in Poland. There's also camps in Germany, but the Germans preferred to send all the Jews to Poland because they felt there was less support for them there, and there were more Jews, of course, living there already. And the 6 major death factories were in Poland. And those included Majdanek, Chełmno, Sobibor, and Treblinka, and as well as Auschwitz. Belzec is an interesting camp that had not been developed into a site to visit until quite recently. And I was there a few years ago, but they've put up a really moving memorial there. It says this is the site of the murder of about 500,000, 500,000 victims of the Belzec death camp, established for the purpose of killing the Jews of Europe, whose lives were snuffed out between February and December of 1942. In less than a year, that camp was in operation and was it killed 500,000 people. And this verse from the book of Job is printed somewhere on the signs at all of those death factories. It's where Job says, "Earth, do not cover my blood. Let there be no resting place for my outcry." And the Nazi rail system, which was able to function from places like France and Italy and Germany and the areas around Poland. And here are the 6 camps that they were taking the Jews to. They couldn't take them all there at once, so that's where the ghettos and the holding camps were developed. And people thought that they had been sent there to work. They were told when they were rounded up to take all of their belongings that they could carry and that they would be working in these places. They were going to be sent to labor factories. Well, they weren't really keen on that, but they'd already been persecuted. Many of them had had all of their valuables stolen. And they thought, well, maybe we can work and rebuild. And they had their children. So, I mean, it was easy to say after the war, how come you guys didn't know what was going on? I mean, how did you cooperate? But there wasn't any organized resistance because everything had been handled subtly. And when the Nazis talked about the final solution, it wasn't quite clear what that meant. So it's easy to judge later in history what people should have seen quite obviously at the time, but it really isn't our place to judge the people who were mistaken. We just need to learn from it and be sure that we don't do it again. So the uniqueness of the Holocaust. Germany was the intellectual center, music, art, literature. This was not a downtrodden place. Historically, it had been a center of civilization and of, it had a highly educated population, modern bureaucracy, technologically advanced. I mean, the Americans who went there in the pre-war years were really impressed. I mean, so the Germans are really restoring things. And the categories involved in World War II were the perpetrators, the victims, and the bystanders. This book by Raoul Hilberg is one of the basic books that you read in Holocaust studies. And it's the Jewish catastrophe, it's called. But less than 1% of the non-Jewish Europeans became rescuers. We should honor the rescuers, and it's important to know the stories about them, but we need to remember they were very few. And most of us would like to think, oh, if this was happening, if the Jews, were being rounded up in our area, we'd definitely protest. But remember, those things hardly ever start with a bang. They start with a little whimper. Jan Karski was one of the Polish army officers who tried to stop the Holocaust. He had many Jewish friends and lived in an area with many other Jews. He was served in the army, and he realized that they were killing off the Jews, and he was smuggled by his Jewish friends into, they think it was a camp in Belzec. He wasn't quite sure which camp he'd been to. He thought it was Auschwitz, but anyway, research has proved it was somewhere else. But they wanted him to see what was going on in the camps I think it was in 42 or early 43. And then he was sent to London, and he nearly died on the way. He had to hike over mountains and was shot at by Nazis. But he made it to London, talked to representatives of the Churchill government, told them what was happening. They said, well, you should tell the people in America. So they sent him on a ship to America, and he met with Roosevelt and some of the leaders in Washington. And one of the Jewish men on that staff, was really shocked by what Karski was saying. And Roosevelt said that, we were doing the best we could. We were fighting the Nazis and we would rescue the Jews. But of course, they had no intention of really rescuing people from the camps. And the Jewish man who was the Supreme Court judge at the time heard the story and said to Karski, in the presence of the Polish ambassador who was in Washington also, he said, the Supreme Court judge said, I can't believe this man. And the Polish ambassador said, you can't be calling this man a liar. He's suffered to come here and tell us this story. He said, I didn't say he's a liar. I said, I can't believe the story. And American Jews really had trouble accepting the stories that were told too. They were just beginning to feel accepted in America, and they didn't want to rock the boat. But the Avenue of the Righteous at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, and I've been there many times, has in the beginning tried to plant a tree for every rescuer that they identified. Got to be so many rescuers that they began the whole area down at the bottom of the hill, where it's kind of a town you walk through, and there are names of various towns where rescuers came from. But it's a really important place to visit. First time I was on a trip to Poland and Germany in the late 70s. The group I was with didn't want to go to Yad Vashem when we were in Jerusalem. They had planned it for this Christian group, and they didn't think we'd want to see that. So I knew it was there, and I found out where it was, and I hired a taxi cab and took the 6 people who were traveling with me to see it. And at that time it was, just kind of being worked on, but it's an important place to visit. And the rescuers they keep finding new stories all the time, even though most of the originals are dead by now, but family stories are still coming forth. And in recent years, they've got the total up to over 26,000 rescuers who have been identified. And some of the more well-known ones are Miep Gies, who was the woman who worked for Anne Frank's father and rescued the Frank family for several years before they were betrayed by someone else and sent to Auschwitz. And this is the story of Les Chambon. And if you don't know that story, I've got a lovely film about it. It's a really great story about this village in France where they rescued 5,000, mainly children and mainly Jewish children, although some non-Jews were in that group too. But this was the pastor of the Protestant church in that town. And there was also a Catholic church, and they all worked together, which I'm always glad to hear. And they arranged to rescue, as I say, about 5,000 mainly Jewish children and who survived the war. And one of the children who was born there, a guy named Pierre Sauvage, eventually made a film about that story. Weapons of the Spirit, it's called. And here we have Irina Sendler. She was a young woman nurse in Poland who managed to smuggle babies. She only dared take children who weren't old enough to talk because, you know, they could have told things innocently. But she rescued 2,500 small children and babies from the Warsaw Ghetto, whose parents were ultimately killed. And she smuggled them into Warsaw, and she kept exact records of the true name of the child and the name of the parents and where they came from on really thin pieces of paper, which she hid in a jar of apples and hid under an apple tree in her backyard. And she was eventually arrested, tortured, actually was crippled for life. Well, I spent the rest of her life in a wheelchair, but she never gave up where these things were buried in her yard. And at the end of the war, she told the people where it was, and they managed to dig those records up and find out who these children really were. And she tried very hard to have them sent to Israel with Jewish families. And then there's, of course, Corrie ten Boom, and we all know her story from Holland. And when you go to Krakow, be sure to visit the Schindler factory. Oskar Schindler wasn't the nicest guy in the neighborhood, but he was shocked at what was happening to his Jewish employees and managed to have them listed as irreplaceable employees. And many people who survived the war eventually rescued him when he was an elderly man and was sick with cancer. It's another good story. But here we come pretty much to the end. There's so much more that can be told. We could talk about post-war anti-Semitism, but this is probably enough painful study for one night. And there may be no more succinct description of the Holocaust than the statement issued by the Vatican in March of 1998, which is during the time when John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, the Polish Pope, was in office. And as I've spent time in Poland, I really become a fan of Pope John Paul. He was somebody who had Jewish friends. His mother died when he was a little kid, and his Jewish schoolmate and his family took poor little Carol in and fed him lunch every day. And he was really close with this Jewish family. And when he became Pope, his first personal visitor was the guy who was his Jewish friend from Krakow. Anyway, the statement that was issued by the Vatican during the time that John Paul was in charge said, this century has witnessed an unspeakable tragedy, which can never be forgotten, the attempt by the Nazi regime to exterminate the Jewish people, with the consequence killing of millions of Jews, women, men, old, young, children, and infants, for the sole reason of their Jewish origin. They were persecuted and deported. Some were killed immediately, while others were degraded, ill-treated, tortured, and utterly robbed of their human dignity, and then murdered. Very few of those who entered the concentration camps survived, and those who did remained scarred for life. This was the Shoah. That's the Hebrew name for the Holocaust. And speaking to 60 theologians and clergy around the world at a Vatican symposium in 1997, Pope John Paul said, Erroneous and unjust interpretations of the New Testament regarding the Jewish people and their alleged culpability have circulated for too long and contributed to a lulling of many consciences at the time of World War II, so that while there were Christians who did everything they could to save those who were being persecuted, even to the point of risking their own lives, the spiritual resistance of many was not what humanity had a right to expect of Christ's disciples. Agreed. So this is not a happy teaching, but thank you for listening. And if any of you, I assume that Elon will have a copy of this. I'd like to make it available to people, that if you run into people who don't think the Holocaust ever happened or don't know the history of it, I'd like to have this available to anybody who wants it. So blessings and thanks for your patience in listening to a sad story.
Thank you so much, JoAnn.
So, blessings on you all. And you might want to take a deep breath and have a sip of coffee, but if you have questions or comments or things you'd like to talk about, we're here.
You can all unmute yourself, please.
Oh yeah, unmute.
Can't hear you, Carol. You were talking to yourself, Carol.
Carol, unmute, unmute.
Unmute. I was looking at your book in the corner, Mosaic, and I pointed to Andy. There's my copy of it right over there.
Yep, right. I've promoted that book for years.
It was a great teaching, JoAnn.
Yeah,
It really is.
really in-depth, JoAnn, just awesome.
Well,
One of the things
thanks
that's-
for listening. And as I say, once Elon gets it copied, we
Yeah.
can distribute that.
Yeah.
It
One of
made
the
me
things that
think of
really-
Ecclesiastes. There's nothing new under the sun.
No,
It just keeps happening and happening.
yeah,
But one of the things that stuck out, JoAnn, was that, you know, you hear about the Crusades and on from there. I didn't realize that even prior to the Crusades,
Yeah.
you know, this was going on. You know, this is,
yeah. It goes way back to the book of Genesis. I mean,
It does, way back to the beginning.
once Abraham
Yeah.
shows up.
yeah,
And I mean, for those of us who take the Bible seriously, and I'm not trying to sell it to those who don't, but I do think that we have to realize God made a choice of the Jewish people
yeah,
to share his secrets about the world and how it came into being. And I think when we read the book of Genesis, we don't have to assume that we have a detailed story of how the world was created. But what starts with the stories of Abraham are historical events that can be recognized in
yeah,
the geography. And but it's immediately, you know, the people by that time had invented all sorts of religious ideas. And God had chosen the Jews and kind of kept them separate because it took them a while to learn what their role was in it. And it's easy for we who are Christians to criticize what the Jews did or didn't do, but we wouldn't know any of this. Those of us who come from Norway and Sweden would be worshiping all kinds of Scandinavian gods if it hadn't been for the Jews writing down their
Yeah.
story and telling it generation by generation. So I am at age 84, I am thrilled to have had a grandmother who told me that God cared about the Jews, and to have met Jewish people from all over the world, and to partner with Elon week by week to do
Yeah.
these things. You know, that I go to bed happy and wake up happy every day.
oh, that's
While
awesome.
coughing and stretching and trying to get all the muscles to move in a familiar way. Anyway, I wouldn't have missed any of the interesting adventures I've been able to experience, and the many wonderful people I've met in Israel and Poland and all over the place. And everywhere you go in the world, there's somebody who has a bit of the story you haven't heard before. So,
And everywhere she goes in the world, they recognize her.
well, not all.
Almost.
I do have friends in odd places.
JoAnn, did you at one time author an article about Minneapolis and anti-Semitism? And what
I-
that was?
I believe I've written several of them over the years. And I do have some stuff in my files.
Do you know what year period, what we're talking in the 1900s or the 1800s or the recent? Any,
Well, actually, the situation in Minneapolis, it starts in the 1920s and 30s.
okay.
I mean, Minneapolis and St. Paul are twin cities, and the Jewish community here has written extensively on that too. I think we have a PowerPoint on that story somewhere in the files here too, but we should find that and show it.
Yeah.
But basically, St. Paul was settled first. The immigrants came to St. Paul, and more of the Eastern Europeans, the Poles and less wealthy people came to St. Paul, and St. Paul then became the capital. Later, when there had been quite a bit of settlement in Minneapolis in the 30s, and then after World War II, even before, many more Jews came to Minneapolis. They settled on the near north side, and were not real welcome on the south side, although there are synagogues. There's one about 4 blocks from where I lived in South Minneapolis. And I did go to school with Jewish kids at Lindale School in the 1940s and early 50s. But Minneapolis had more rules about where Jews could settle, and they were allowed to live in North Minneapolis, but once the suburbs started settling, in fact, a Jewish friend of mine told me that his family, his dad had served in World War II and came back and wanted to buy a house in Richfield. I mean, we lived in Richfield. It's a kind of crummy suburb. I mean, little story and a half houses, it was built, wildly after the end of the war. And this family, this Jewish family, wanted to settle there and get their kids in school there. And when the real estate person seemed a little edgy about showing them a house and said, well, you should probably talk to the school principal and see how your kids will fit in. And the principal said, your kind would be happier in St. Louis Park, which of course was the one suburb where Jews were moving in West Minneapolis. And actually this guy was my dentist years ago. He's retired now, but he said that his Jewish relatives were told they shouldn't buy in Richfield because their kind would be happier in St. Louis Park.
Boy,
If I can actually share with you guys, because while JoAnn was talking about it, I found the September 1946 article about it.
Mm-hmm.
And do you see it on your screen now?
Yep. Yeah.
So an article entitled Minneapolis, the Curious Twin, written by essayist Carrie McWilliams, was published in Common Ground magazine, September 1946.
Mm-hmm.
He proclaimed Minneapolis is the capital of anti-Semitism in the United States. In almost every walk of life, Iron Curtain separates Jews in Minneapolis. And I have here a few pages of these one.
Yeah.
Only 4% of the population, Jews, were publicly and unapologetically excluded from membership in private country clubs. Not just there, also from Lion,
Rotary, Lions, and Kiwanis.
yeah, and groups like the Toastmasters.
Mm-hmm.
Jews were even buried from the Minneapolis chapter of the American Automobile Club.
The AAA. And the reason for that was the AAA owned a golf course in Minneapolis. So Jews could join the AAA in St. Paul because they didn't have a golf course. In Minneapolis, heaven forfend that Jews and Christians should play golf together. So the whole AAA didn't take Jewish members in Minneapolis.
And discrimination had turned away Jewish professionals, and in 1948, frustrated Jewish doctors started their own hospital, Mount Sinai, after being denied access to the Minneapolis medical facilities.
Yep. Right.
Jews were buried from local chapters of labor unions. It had been started in New York by Jewish organizers. Summer resorts on the Lake Minnetonka advertised that they cater to Gentiles only.
Mhm.
Department stores such as Montgomery Ward refused to interview Jewish job applicants. Many neighborhoods were restricted, bearing Jews, Blacks, and even Catholic and Italians.
Mhm.
Jewish teachers were few and far between.
Yep.
Many of them had to change their last name. The one that did teach had to change their last name, so God forbid someone will know they're Jewish, right?
Yep.
The discrimination was much more pronounced in Minneapolis than in St. Paul, according to McWilliams, as JoAnn mentioned.
Mhm.
Now listen to
Yeah.
read that, okay? It even became endorsed
The-
by Reverend William Bell Riley at the
Right.
First Baptist Church in Minneapolis, whose sermons were anti-Semitic and
Diatribes.
diatribe, along with Reverend Luke Rader.
Right.
Bell was identified as a rebel rouser in his article. An article on the internet by Doug Linder in 2004 say in the early 1930s, he, Riley, preached a virulent form of anti-Semitism and became fascist sympathizer.
Mhm.
And actually, I don't have it here because I just put a part of the report. It's not the whole
Yeah.
report. They actually went into the heart of the Jewish community in North Minneapolis and started a radio station there,
Mhm.
intimidated the Jewish people. A lot of their very hateful preaching against Jews came from a radio station that was based in the heart of the Jewish community.
Mhm. Yeah, I do have a PowerPoint on this, and I'll
Yeah.
find it and show it to you guys. But one of the aspects of this that's interesting to me was, when I was a kid, when I was, in the early 50s, when I was in high school, and I was applying for jobs, part-time jobs, there were still often want ads that said Gentiles only may apply. That was
Wow.
normal in Minneapolis in the 50s.
And I have Jewish friends that bought homes in Minnetonka,
Yeah.
and they had an old deed that, when you buy the land,
Mhm.
that says that you cannot sell this land to Jews and Blacks.
Yep.
Oh,
Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
it was written subtly. It wasn't in the wide place where you could see it, but it's hidden in all of these property, official papers. But when you probably all know, I worked for many years for a group called Bridges for Peace. And that was started in Minneapolis by a professor whose parents were missionaries in Korea. And he was from Canada, but he hadn't been to America as a kid. So he came back to America to go to college and went to a Presbyterian college out in the East Coast. And then he went to grad school in a Jewish college right at the end of World War II. So he studied in this college with students who had lost grandparents in the war who were Jewish. And his name was Dr. G. Douglas Young. And he was hired by Billy Graham to head up the organization Bridges for Peace, which was started with help from that Baptist church downtown where William B. Riley had been the pastor during the war years. And of course, the Minneapolis Jews thought that church was an awful place. And Doug Young, when he came to Minneapolis, didn't know this whole story, but he was very pro-Jewish. And he had an office downtown Minneapolis, a couple blocks away from the JCRC. And once he got settled in his office, and he started, teaching about the history of anti-Semitism. And then somebody told him, well, the Jewish community is just down the block there. So he went down there and knocked on the door one day. And there was an old man that I knew, and I've forgotten his name now, but he was working in that office at the time, elderly Jewish man. He's long dead now, but I remember him telling me this story. I'd heard it from Doug Young, but Doug Young knocked on the door and they let him in. And he said, hi, I'm Doug Young. I'm teaching over at, the office was at that Baptist church at that time. So he said, I'm teaching a group of Christian students, and I want them to learn about Jewish history and the Holocaust. And I'm wondering if anybody from this office would be willing to come and teach my class. I'm Doug Young, and I'm the professor over there. And they looked at him and said, you're who? From where? And this guy said, after we scraped ourselves off the floor, we said, what? This can't be. And they didn't trust him. But, recently we saw that story about the death of the rabbi in Texas that befriended John Hagee. And that's kind of what happened here. There was just a couple people in that JCRC office that said, we should give this guy a chance. He says he cares about the Jews. Let's get together. And there were several people from that office who really opened that door. And I kind of inherited the work that Doug Young had started here. So that's in the 70s when I began getting involved in this stuff. He'd gone to Israel and he started the Institute of Holy Land Studies on Mount Zion in Jerusalem. So,
And
And,
who paid his wage to go to Israel?
Carol did.
What? Am I
What?
not on?
Carol did.
No, JoAnn, who paid the way for him to go to Israel the first time?
oh, I've forgotten.
It was the Jewish community paid his way to go
Okay,
to Israel.
yeah. You're right. They, in 19, I
They
think
wanted him to
56.
go.
Yeah.
Now I want you all to know that the reason is it's not that whole that thing stopped in the 1940s. Even when I moved here, I ran into some anti-Semitic incidents, and one of them was major for me when I realized that the Nazi Party was marching downtown St. Paul with their on them. And then later I found out that the headquarters of the Nazi Party was right here in St. Paul.
Yeah.
Only about 10 years ago or so.
And that's in the 1990s.
And actually in the after that, like just about 10, 12 years ago, they moved to Michigan. And if people don't believe me, let me share something with you, because I'm telling them when I went to their website, that was just a few years back, when they told me, what do you mean? Are they in Michigan? I'm saying, you see my screen?
Yep.
Yep.
I'm saying, yes, they're in Michigan. You see Detroit, Michigan?
Yep.
Because everybody remember where they used to be, they kept their phone number. What is their phone number?
651.
Phone number.
651 area code.
Wow.
Okay. That's
St. Paul number.
the America's Nazi Party. And
Local.
and some of the things, just that you'll realize kind of where they stand. By the way, look who they adore. Look who's on the website.
Wow.
Okay. By the way, every time I see the number 88, I become a little bit anxious. You know why they have 88 here?
No.
Everywhere? What is the 8th letter in the English alphabet?
A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. H.
What does H mean?
Well, part of it.
I have to
may
deal
mean
with
Hitler.
that guy here at the bottom.
Oh,
Heil
Hitler.
Hitler.
Yeah, Heil
Hitler.
Hitler, yeah.
So that's their code. That's their code
Heil
for 8.
Hitler?
Every time you see 88, you see
that's right.
someone that kind of give the Heil Hitler salute, right? It's in their own way.
Mhm.
And if you want to know in their own part of their points, look at that. Only members of the nation may be citizens of the state. Only no Jew or homosexual may be a member of the nation. Okay, that's from
Those
their,
pure white blood.
yeah.
Mm.
And if you think that was a long time ago, look when you see 2007,
Yeah,
Oh,
that's 2007 neo-Nazi plan book burning. That's right here in
yeah.
the Twin Cities. And here's the book burning. This is right here.
Where
Hey,
was that done?
I wonder
And
what kind of books were they?
that's
burning?
like about 15 minutes away from my
Yeah, you
home,
can see
right here. And you can see some of the books. Right.
Mhm.
Judaism
Yeah. And you can see they're very proud. You can see their
and
kids. Okay.
Mhm. Yeah,
And they make sure to look at their megaphones, have this
yeah.
on it and what they wear on their arms. And they're not even covering their faces. They're not shy to show who they are. And
Israel.
yeah, actually in some of the photos, you can see kids, by the way.
oh,
Oh, here, you can see here, you can
There,
see
right
some
there.
kids.
yes.
Okay, they bring their kids with.
Mm.
Yes, we were talking about the 40s, but I experienced that myself.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Wow,
Awful.
I am so naive. I grew up in New Hope when it was farmland.
Yeah,
So I was in like a glass bubble protected from all this.
So was
Sure. well, I didn't know about all of it, but I knew about some of it. Certainly but by the 50s, I'd learned a lot about it. And my grandma, who
I.
was
Oh my gosh.
old and not able to get around much by the time I was born, but she knew that the Jews had been picked on in Minneapolis, and she wanted me to be sure that I knew that God wanted the Jews to be back in Israel and filling God's plan for them.
Yeah. Thank you, Elon.
And it's 9:05. JoAnn, do you want to close with a prayer?
Yes, I think we've had a big evening, and thank you all for your
Fantastic.
patience. And I will pray that none of you will have bad dreams because of this, but that we will think of positive ways to react and to push forward and to stand with Elon and all of our Jewish friends
Yes.
whenever
Right.
there's
Amen. Yes.
Yeah.
Lord, we just thank you for the privilege of being called to be your servants. And we thank you that we are grafted into our Jewish community where we haven't replaced it. And I thank you so much for all of our Jewish friends that we've become partners with in these years. And I pray for the coming generation and for the young people who don't know the stories and who need to hear them. Just give us wisdom as to how to share the bad news from the past, that we will be better representatives of the good news that we have in the Bible. So we thank you, Lord, for the privilege of being your servants. And we do pray for those who are not with us tonight. I pray especially for Dave and Nancy. I know that she's still having some struggles with her recovery from her surgery. So we just ask for your special blessing on her. And we pray for all of our families and friends who are struggling with various emotional and physical challenges at this time. And we thank you again for the privilege of being your servants. Just bless each of the families represented here. And I pray especially for Elon and thank you for his presence among us, and just ask a special blessing on him this week. We pray in your name, Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, JoAnn. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Have a good week, and we'll see
Yeah,
what
have a
happens
good
next
week.
week.
Yes, absolutely. And stay safe out there. I believe you don't supposed to go out tomorrow.
No,
Yeah.
I'm trying to stay in the house according to what my doctor has
Yes.
said, that my cough will not get better if I spend very much time outside. So,
No, it won't.
oh, and I see Gadali was here with us. Hi,
Yes.
Oh
Gadali.
yeah, I joined you a long
Oh,
time.
there he is.
I was
Hi,
just
Joe.
quiet, So.
Good. Well, Elon, when you get this section put
Copy, yes.
Well, there was a separate.
distributed, let us
Sorry,
know, 'cause
Joanna.
I'd like people to have a copy of the one. we
Oh, okay, got it.
Yes, yes, yes.
Good,
Okay.
wonderful.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Shalom,
Bye-bye.
Haverim, Shalom, Haverim, Shalom.